when you look at aggression and you talk about what aggression is, it's really interesting because the topography of aggression can take so many different views. It can come across so many different ways: verbal aggression, physical aggression, and so forth. How many of you currently work with individuals that have autism? All right, good, the majority of us. Okay, so let's just, to get us started, let's talk a little bit about what autism is, a little bit of the historical context of autism, and kind of where we are today. Well, as you guys know, the prevalence of autism continues to increase and increase and increase. So the diagnostic values for autism and how we're diagnosing autism is changing. And because of that, you see that the prevalence is coming down. What I mean by coming down is it used to be 1 in 150. Now I believe we are now 1 in 56, I think is where we are today. So you see that the prevalence is more and more and more. One of the interesting things that comes along with autism are social communicative deficits. Along with that, you tend to most commonly hear aggression. Raise your hand if you've known of someone that has autism that also has aggression. Okay. Autism itself, originally when it was looked at, was considered to be schizophrenia. Originally they thought autism was schizophrenia. Because it was schizophrenia, or because the tendencies looked like it was schizophrenic, the individuals were socially reclused, not very active. They had deficits when it came to some sort of communicative issues. They felt, it really looks like it's possibly schizophrenia. Well, as time went on and people started doing studies like Cantor here in 43, said, well, they have tendencies to be reclusive, but they're not hearing voices. They're not seeing things, so how can that be schizophrenia? It doesn't make sense. So that's where we started seeing kind of the road fork, if you will. People started saying, no, hold on, it's something actually a little bit different. So if you start looking at Franz Asperger's in 44, he said, wait a minute, this can start as young as age 2, and in some cases, we start seeing some of the symptomatic issues even younger. Does anybody know what some of the very basic physical symptomatic issues are of autism? Stemming, very good. Believe it or not, tippy-toe walking. See a lot of this? Just because somebody tippy-toe walks doesn't mean, however, that they're autistic. Keep that in mind. It's just symptoms. There's a criteria that has to be met of a group of symptoms before you can be diagnosed with it. So they started saying, prior to age 2, we're starting to be able to see a little bit more and more about this. So there are 9 basic characteristics that have to be met in order for the individual to say, well, if you have these 9 characteristics, you possibly have autism. Now, as you guys know, the DSM is changing and has changed, so those characteristics change along with it. Well, as those characteristics change, a lot of things come with it and a lot of things go with it. For example, Asperger's, it's no longer part of the DSM. It's now just categorized as general autism. A lot of people will talk about autism as high functioning or low functioning. Clinically, though, there is no difference. Keep that in mind. When you're actually using your diagnostic values, you will not see a difference between high and low. It's just categorized under one umbrella. Does anybody know what the diagnosis is for those individuals that meet some characteristics but do not have all of them? PDD-NOS, very good. Pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. When you see PDD-NOS, that basically means you have some characteristics of autism, but not all of them. However, in the clinician's mind, it's important enough for them to get services, so we're going to give you this diagnosis. And that usually creates the first step in them understanding what kind of assistance needs to happen. Okay. 1968, Rutherford, you started noticing that there's a higher male to female ratio. He's like, you know, it's interesting. You're seeing more men or young boys with autism than you are girls. How many of you guys see that currently? Absolutely. Based off of your experience, how many do you see are more aggressive with males than females? If they're more aggressive with males, by a show of hands? More aggressive with females, by a show of hands? I love how social context works at the same time, because you're like, okay, everybody raised their hand for males. So if I raise mine and I'm the only one for females, I might look a little weird, so I'm not going to raise it. But inside my mind, I know that it might be. Yeah, so that's something that we're seeing. And then as time has gone on, since the 60s, they've started even defining autism more and more and provided more characteristics about specifically what it is. They also notice that there isn't relapse. If you have autism, you don't necessarily relapse. Now, in a second, we'll talk about developmental disorders that do have relapse and which ones those are. But they're saying, no, that's not actually autism. The one thing that's really interesting about autism, again, is that even though there's a social communicative deficit, think about this for a second. Autism is here, right? The connection isn't there. When I look at this young lady here, I look at her eyes, I'm like, okay, she's seeing me look at her, and I'm seeing her look back at me. That's gone. It's not intact. Ask yourself this question, which is very interesting. How often do you see, if I may borrow this real quick, sure, kids with iPads? Here. iPads, don't get me wrong, iPads are great, and they provide us great resources and great education for our kids. However, if autism is here, and this is between us, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. We have to create the social context in order to bring out the social skills that are necessary for independent functioning. Those are absolutely critical skills. Just a thought, just a thought. As the DSM has changed over time and the diagnostic values have increased, what we're beginning to see is there's a portion of our population now that is going without services. Individuals that were formerly diagnosed with Asperger's now, under the new DSM guidelines, no longer qualify for those types of services. Some of them have actually been removed as being autistic. Here's the challenge that we have as professionals working in this field. How do we nurture those individuals and get them support if financially there is no support for them? That's the biggest challenge we have. Here's the other thing. Little kids with autism are really, really cute. Yeah, they may punch, hit you, scratch you, or cry, but guess what? At some point, that little child is going to be 25 years old. And the prevalence of adults today needing services is incredible. Can anybody tell me what the wait time is today in Bexar County for an individual with developmental disabilities under the DADS program to get services is?
6 years.
You got it. 6 years. That's the wait list for you to be seen by a developmental specialist. 6 years. So there's a tremendous amount of people out there that need our help. So thank you for being here today, because this is really a stepping stone to saying, what else can we do to really help this population? Okay. When you look at pervasive developmental disorders, autism itself is kind of in an umbrella with a lot of other developmental disorders. You have MR, learning disorders, or IDD as it's called today, motor skill disorders, communication disorders, ADHD, ADD, eating disorders, tic disorders, and emotional disorders that all kind of go into a little ball, if you will. As you look at these pervasive developmental disorders, ask yourself, does aggression go with them? It depends. It depends all upon you. It depends how you define what aggression is. Raise your hand if you've gone through aggression today. Okay, one individual. Anybody else? Did anybody have a change of clothes this morning, or you set up your clothes this morning, you got up, when you got up, you looked at your clothes, you're like, no, I'm not going to wear that. I'm going to wear something else. And it's like, oh, I have to hurry up and find something else and put on something else to go. Anybody have that experience this morning? Is that aggression? Frustration? Anger? How do you define it? Everybody have any problems getting parking today? Oh, hot button. Hot button. That was a fun hot button. Yeah, ask yourself about parking. Was that frustrating? Was that difficult? The topography of how we define aggression is really interesting. What we see most commonly as we treat these individuals is one topography of aggression is very different from the other topography of aggression, but the way they describe it is the same. That's interesting. In a second, we're going to do a little exercise because I want you to wrap your mind around something that's going to be very different in how we're traditionally taught to think in the psychology world. So it's going to be a paradigm shift for us. These are the most common DSM categories that we see under PDD. Autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, which is no longer part of the DSM, Rhett's disorder. Is everyone familiar with Rhett's? Okay, go about 2 to 3 years, and then the body begins to degenerate. Skills, small faces, small hands, predominantly in females. PDD-NOS, and then childhood disintegrative or dissociative identity disorder, which is when the individual goes up to about age 3, normal, acquiring skills, functional, and then at about 3 to 3.5, they start regressing. It's interesting because cognitively, in some cases, you will read that the child will actually ask the parents, what's wrong with me? How come I can't remember how to do this anymore? And over time, they become wheelchair bound. So that's one that you see that's a small percentage, but you do see that out there. The common characteristics you're going to see are social interaction deficits, communication deficits, and repetitive or restrictive types of behaviors. Those are your commonalities that you will see within the PDD-NOS or the PDD umbrella, if you will. Okay, so let's talk about challenging behaviors. Who has challenging behaviors? I love that. Yay, somebody give her a high five. She says, I do. We all do. Anyone ever gotten upset with their husband or their wife? No, that never happens, right? No. The guys ever leave the toilet seat up still? Forget to put their socks in the dirty laundry and they leave them by the bedside, perhaps? Kids ever frustrate you when you get home because the house is not clean? This is a very, very weird statement that I'm about to make, but if you don't remember anything at all about today, specifically to this session, remember this. When you're working with an individual that has autism or a developmental disorder and you see aggression, that is a beautiful thing. Here's why. The aggression is their voice. They are attempting to communicate something, but don't know or have the skills on how to do it. So aggression is actually not necessarily a bad thing. Aggression is a mechanism to tell you, I need to learn how to communicate this differently, but I don't know how. So I'm going to use whatever aggressive method I do to try to get what I need. Does that make sense? What do you guys think? Are you okay with that?
Except when you're on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, let me tell you, many black eyes, bruised ribs, been there. I'm totally there with you. Went to one home one time, Dad says, kid's not aggressive at all. I'm like, are you sure? Absolutely. Kid was 6'2", about 240 pounds. So sat down with Dad and I said, what are the issues? Well, the particular issue is when we switch it away from the Disney Channel, he gets, very upset and we can't have people over. Okay, I got you. So I said, let's baseline this and figure it out. And I said, Dad, your son is a very large man. Are you sure he's not aggressive? No. Now, I knew better because when I walked in the home, I saw all the floating patch on the walls. And you kind of get used to that. You're like, okay, I notice there's no glass in here. I noticed the center table is all wood with nothing on it. So you start looking for those things. So I kept my space. I sat down, and Dad says, don't worry, we're going to flip it. He's just going to get aggressive. Flipped the channel, changed it. He bit into a basketball and deflated it, and then he came right at my face. So I knew if I reacted to his punch, what was I doing to the punch? Reinforcing the behavior. So now he knows, ooh, if I punch somebody, I'm going to get them to act a certain way, so I'll punch more often. So he punches me, and I sit there, and he just looks at me like, aren't you going to change it back? I said, no, we're going to leave it on. And Dad's looking at me like, oh, my God. I've known this guy 15 minutes, and he's already gotten punched. Holy moly. So Dad whispers, he's going to calm down. So he goes over to Dad and punches Dad. I turn over and I look at Dad. Dad looks at me, can we take a break? So a lot of times you have to be very clued into what quote-unquote aggression is. If it's physical, can there be verbal aggression? Yes. Oh, absolutely. Think about somebody you cut off on the road, the beautiful signs that they give you through the window, and the things that they tell you when you're driving by them, and especially if they catch up to you and they give you that look. Sure, those are all different types of forms of aggression. Now, the individuals that we work with in the developmental delay arena are 2 to 3 times more likely to have aggression than the neurotypical person, because we have a voice to express, even if it's not functionally express what we want, what we think, or what we don't want. We have that and they don't. So keep that in mind.